The morning cold was sharp and dry, hanging in the air like a promise that nothing came easy on this land. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment down below telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of grit, sorrow, and unexpected redemption out here on the frontier. These stories grow stronger when we share them, when we keep them alive together. Now, let's step into it. Jed Nolan opened the cabin door with his gloved hand. His boots crunched through the crust of snow that had settled in the night, thin enough not to bury the land, but heavy enough to mute it, to press a quietness down on the trees and rocks and fence posts that lined his world. The sky wore its dull blue-gray cloak, sun nowhere to be seen, only a pale suggestion along the far ridge. Jed adjusted the brim of his hat against the wind, pulled his collar high, and stepped into the silence. The ranch had been half alive for years, ever since Sarah, his wife, passed in childbirth, taking their son with her. 5 winters had chewed that truth into his bones. 5 winters of one chair at the table, 1 bowl on the shelf, 1 bed cold on one side. He moved through the mornings now without rush, because there was no one to hurry for, no one to expect him home before the light slipped away. His limp, a souvenir from a horse gone sideways years before, never quite left, though he'd grown so used to favoring the left side uphill that it felt like part of him, not a wound. Jed's breath rose in short bursts as he passed the water trough, already frozen solid. He noted it without feeling, the way a man notes the weather, just another thing to manage. The barn doors groaned as he pushed them wide, and a wave of warmth, thin animal heat warmth, rolled out. Inside smelled of hay and leather, horses shifting and huffing in their stalls, eyes soft and watchful. Jed liked that steadiness. Horses never asked for more than feed and care, and they gave back in silence. He preferred that silence over words. He went to work with the pitchfork, moving slow but measured, tossing hay into the stalls, listening to the soft thud of hooves and the rustle of straw. Routine first, feed a second. That was how he kept his mind straight. He moved down the line, greeted each horse with the same care, until he came to the far end, and that's where his world tipped. There, curled into the hay, small as she could fold herself, was a woman. Her knees were pulled tight to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to shrink into the earth. Her dress, once some pale frontier beige, was torn, filthy, hanging loose over her frame. A rip at the bodice exposed a bare shoulder, and that single curve, fragile, unintended, spoke of a vulnerability that made Jed pause. Her hair, dark and tangled, spread across her cheek. Her lips were split, her knuckles raw, her face streaked with dirt and sweat and cold. For a moment he wondered if she was alive, but then her eyes opened, brown, wide, frightened. She didn't scream, didn't scramble away, just stared up at him, as though he were another threat the world had sent, and she was too tired to run. Jed stopped, still as stone, the pitchfork heavy in his hands. Inside, his heart ticked faster, not with panic, not with some sudden pull of desire, but with the hard, grounded weight of responsibility. He didn't know her. She was trespassing on his land, taking refuge in his barn, but she was breathing, trembling, starved, and half frozen. That was enough. "You hurt." His voice came low, even, the way he might calm a skittish colt. Her lips moved but made no sound. He stepped closer, eyes scanning for blood, fresh bruises, broken bones, nothing visible beyond the trembling. her mouth split at one corner, a bruise yellowing on her upper arm. Her fingers quaked from cold more than fear. "You run off." Her eyes flickered, then gave the faintest nod. Jed didn't ask from who, didn't ask why, not then. Those questions could wait. For now, there was a shivering woman in his barn, and the snow promising another long night. He stood, turned without another word, and walked back across the yard to the cabin. Inside, the stove burned low. He poured hot water into a tin cup, cut off the last wedge of cornbread, wrapped it in cloth. He lifted the wool blanket from its peg by the door. He didn't stop to wonder if he should, if it was wise, if this woman might bring trouble with her. Grief had hollowed him too much for second guessing. What little humanity he had left was habit, and habit told him you didn't let a body freeze if you could stop it. When he returned, she hadn't moved. Her eyes tracked him warily, watching every step, every item in his hands, like she expected him to pull something cruel from the bundle. Jed set the food and water on a hay bale. He unfolded the blanket slowly, careful not to crowd her, and held it out. "You can stay here a while," he said, voice steady. "Ain't nobody going to drag you out. But the barn won't keep you past tonight. You freeze out here, you won't wake up." She hesitated, then pushed herself upright with effort. Her hands shook as she lifted the tin, drank slow, both palms wrapped tight as though the heat might run away. She nibbled at the bread like her stomach had forgotten how to eat. Jed didn't linger. He turned back to his chores, tossing hay, breaking ice, checking hooves. He let her be. By the time he closed the barn doors and stepped back into the morning, the sun had broken pale across the ridge, staining the snow with weak yellow light. He didn't look back, but the thought stayed with him. A stranger in his barn, a woman bruised, starved, alone, not a threat, not yet, a puzzle. And for the first time in 5 winters, Jed felt something stir in the silence, something like purpose, something like the beginning of a story he hadn't expected to be part of. Jed returned to the cabin that night, the wind pressing against the shutters and the fire inside throwing more shadow than light. He sat in the lone chair, bowl of beans balanced on his knee. But his thoughts didn't rest with the food. They drifted back to the barn, to the figure curled into the hay drinking from the tin cup, with hands raw at the knuckles, bread crumbling between her fingers like dust. He'd seen hunger before, seen desperation in a man's eyes during the war, but what lived in her face wasn't just hunger. It was the look of someone who had been made small for so long. She wasn't sure she had the right to stand straight anymore. Jed leaned back, listening to the logs crackle. His cabin had been a tomb for 5 winters, half lived in, stripped of warmth except for the stove's belly fire. And now, out there, not 50 steps from his door, was a woman fighting to stay alive. He didn't think of her with longing, not the way men in town might. His pulse ticked faster for a different reason, a weight in his chest, heavy with the thought that she might not see the next dawn if left to the cold. He rose after a while, set the bowl aside, and took another blanket from the peg. His boots thudded across the porch, the night air cutting sharper now, stars brittle overhead. He pulled the barn door open, wood groaning, and stepped inside. The horses shifted, blowing steam into the dark, but his eyes found her again, still in that same corner, half buried in straw, half ready to vanish if she could. Her eyes opened before he reached her, brown and wide, and though she didn't speak, the fear in them eased just a fraction, like she was learning his shadow wasn't the kind that raised a hand. He set the blanket down close to her feet. "Got another," he said. "You can stay here." Nobody's pushing you out, but if you don't come in the cabin, you'll freeze." She didn't answer, only stared, cautious, waiting. Jed nodded once, turned, and left the door cracked behind him. He'd made the offer, left the choice to her. That mattered more than words. Inside again, he laid out the old cot by the stove. He hadn't used it in years, but it stood firm enough. He stoked the fire, lit the lamp low, then stretched out on his bed, still dressed, hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't expect her to come. He didn't sleep much either, listening for the faintest sound, wondering if the silence outside meant she was safe or already gone. At dawn, when he returned to the barn, her blanket was folded neat on the hay bale, and the corner where she'd lain was empty. For a moment his chest sank heavy. She was gone. He told himself that was better. Less trouble, fewer questions, but the barn felt colder for it, emptier even with the horses stirring. Yet by midday, when the sun cracked weakly through the clouds, he found her again, curled back into the straw beside the buckskin gelding, as though she'd tried to leave and found the world outside worse than staying. Jed stood in the doorway watching her for a long breath. She was staying. She just didn't know it yet, and maybe neither did he. 3 nights later, when the wind sharpened again and the sky promised more snow, there came a knock at the cabin door. Not loud, not frantic, just soft, a kind of knocking that said the knocker expected nothing, but tried anyway. Jed was stirring beans on the stove when he looked up and saw her shadow in the window, dark against the drift of white. He opened the door without a word. She stepped in slow, boots wet, dress torn at the shoulder, a scrap of cloth knotted to hide the worst of it. Her cheeks glowed pink from the cold, her nose red, her eyes weary but clear. She crossed the threshold like a stray testing the ground. Jed didn't ask for thanks. Her being there was answer enough. He pointed to the cot near the stove. "Warmer than the barn," he said simply. She nodded, sat, her fingers worrying the edge of the blanket. She looked around the cabin, bare shelves, single chair, stove, one bed against the wall. Sparse, clean, built for one and no more. Jed ladled beans into a tin plate and carried it over. "You eat?" She shook her head. He handed her the plate, a spoon. She ate slow, careful, not desperate this time, just steady. The stiffness in her shoulders hadn't eased, but her eyes no longer darted like a trapped animal's. After a while, she spoke. "My name's Calla." Her voice was quiet, even, a voice that hadn't been used much but held steady when it came. Jed nodded once. "Jed." She set the spoon down, looked at him square. "I'm not here to steal or cause trouble." He met her eyes, calm. "Didn't think you were." She hesitated. "I can leave in the morning if you want." He shook his head. "Snow's coming again?" "You'll stay." She didn't argue. That surprised him more than anything. The logs cracked in the stove. The room warmed slowly. For the first time in years, Jed felt something shift inside the cabin's walls. Not just heat from the fire, but presence. Breathing that didn't come from livestock. Footsteps that weren't his alone. He watched her wash her hands and face at the basin without asking. Saw the tremor in her fingers when she peeled back the cloth at her shoulder. The bruise there, purple fading to yellow, told him more than words. Someone had grabbed her hard. She caught him a-looking. "I left before he got worse," she said. He didn't ask who. He only said, "Good." That night, Calla laid on the cot, back to him, shoulders still tense, but she stayed. Jed sat by the fire until it burned low, then lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing. It had been years since another heartbeat lived under his roof. And though grief stirred old ghosts, something else stirred too. Not comfort, not yet, but the first thread of it, the first note of belonging in a house that had forgotten what it meant. Morning came pale, the sky a thin wash of gray that offered no promise of warmth. Jed stirred before the fire, boots heavy on the plank floor, and found Calla already by the stove. Her hair was tied back clumsily, her shoulders bent as she fumbled with the draft. She glanced up when he entered, then down again, her fingers stiff but sure. "I used to cook with wood," she said softly, like she was excusing her hands for touching his stove. "Not on one like this." Jed moved beside her without comment, adjusted the vent, showed her the lever beneath the plate. She watched, eyes sharp even through weariness, and when the flame caught, she smiled faintly. Not wide, but enough to show she remembered how. Jed let the silence stretch, because silence didn't ask for more than a man could give. They ate together that morning, not speaking much, spoons clicking against tin, the fire snapping low. Jed noticed the way she portioned food carefully, not greedy, not wasteful, setting aside a bit of cornbread as if habit taught her never to finish all at once. He noticed the bruise on her arm, fading but still dark, and the way she sat upright, even when she tried to rest her back against the wall. She moved like someone who had learned long ago that slouching meant vulnerability. Jed kept his words to himself, but inside, the recognition burned. He'd known men who treated their horses better than their wives. He'd fought beside soldiers who believed pain was owed to anyone weaker. Looking at Calla's shoulders, the stubborn angle of her jaw, Jed felt a coil tighten a low in his chest. He didn't know her story, not yet, but he knew enough. The days stretched into a rhythm that neither planned but both settled into. Jed worked the barn, the fences, the small shed behind the cabin. Calla swept the floors, boiled water, scrubbed tin plates that hadn't seen shine in years. She mended her dress by the stove, stitching slow, careful, steady, her fingers remembering what they hadn't done in too long. Now and then she would fold one of Jed's shirts, patching thin spots without being asked. Jed didn't comment. He let the act be its own statement. And in return, when she rose from the cot each morning, he found himself laying a second spoon beside the pot without thought. 2 bowls now, 2 spoons. The house adjusting to more than one body. At night, she sat by the fire across from him, shoulders curled but eyes alert. Jed would watch the flames dance against her face, shadows sliding over her cheekbones, and he'd feel the quiet press of something he hadn't expected, peace that wasn't lonesome, not comfort, not yet, but a seed of it planted in silence. One evening she spoke, her voice carrying low over the crackling wood. "My name's Calla." She had told him before, but this time it sounded different, like she was offering it rather than simply stating. Jed nodded slow. "Jed." She met his eyes then, steady, cautious but unflinching. "I'm not here to take what's yours." Jed held her gaze. "Didn't figure you were." She swallowed once, her throat tight. "I'll stay until the snow eases." After that, her words trailed. Jed leaned back, firelight catching the scar on his jaw. "After that, you'll decide." Ain't my choice to make the bruise on her arm began to fade, yellow softening to green. And Jed saw her fingers stop trembling when she folded blankets or poured water from the jug. Her body still carried tension, yes, but her movements slowed, grew deliberate, not frantic. One afternoon, as Jed chopped wood behind the cabin, he caught her watching from the window. Not hiding, not flinching, just watching. her face calm, her eyes following the swing of his axe, the set of his shoulders. For a fleeting second, she looked like she belonged in that frame. Jed felt it stir something quiet in him, like the house wasn't just shelter, but beginning to take on life again. Still, the air between them carried questions unspoken. Jed wondered who she had run from, what name haunted her at night, why her jaw tightened when a branch cracked too close to the cabin. He didn't ask. He figured when she wanted to tell it, she would. Calla, for her part, still glanced at the door each evening, as if making sure it was barred, as if expecting footsteps to come through. But each time the night passed without intrusion, her body loosened fraction by fraction. She no longer clutched her shawl close when she slept. She no longer curled so small on the cot. And it was the fifth night when she surprised him. Jed sat by the fire, boots drying by the stove. His rifle leaned in the corner. Calla handed him a plate of cornbread, then sat across from him. Her leg brushed his under the table, barely a touch, almost by accident. But she didn't move it away. She didn't apologize either. She just sat, eyes on the fire, her body making the smallest declaration. "I trust you enough to stay close." Jed didn't speak, didn't move. He let the moment stand. Inside, though, the weight in his chest shifted, lighter than it had been in years. He went to bed that night, listening to her breathing across the room, steady now, not shallow with fear. The ghosts that had haunted his cabin, Sarah's absence, the silence of a child never born, felt softer, less sharp. He didn't fool himself into thinking they were gone. Grief never truly left. But with Calla's breathing near, the silence no longer rang hollow. It felt shared. And for a man who had lived too long with nothing but his own shadow for company, that small shift was enough to remind him he wasn't finished with life yet. The night passed without storm, only the faint hiss of snow against the shutters. And Jed woke to the scent of coffee already simmering on the stove. Calla was at the hearth, sleeves rolled, hair tied back loose, stirring the pot with measured movements. She didn't startle when he entered, only glanced once, then looked back at her work. That was new. The fear that used to live in her eyes every time the door opened had dulled to watchfulness, steady but no longer frantic. Jed took his seat at the table, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and for a while neither of them spoke. The fire burned steady. The cabin walls creaked with the wind, and the silence between them felt almost comfortable. Almost. After breakfast, she rose from the table, folded her shawl, and went to the basin. The water was cold, biting against her skin, but she didn't flinch. Jed watched from the corner of his eye as she peeled back the cloth tied at her shoulder. The bruise there had begun to yellow, fading from the angry purple it had been when he first noticed it. His chest tightened at the sight of it, though he kept his face even. She must have felt his gaze because her eyes flicked to his. For a long moment neither spoke, then her voice quiet but clear. "I left before he got worse." Jed didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. He just nodded once and said, "Good." That was all. And in the quiet that followed, something eased between them. She hadn't told the whole story, but she had given enough, more than she owed. Jed leaned back in his chair, the firelight catching the sharp lines of his face, and he felt the old soldier in him stir, the one who'd seen too many bruises on women, who never had a chance to leave. His heart pressed heavier, not from pity, but from the fierce understanding that no man had the right to mark her again. That evening, as the fire burned low, Calla sat near the stove mending her dress. The needle moved slow in her hands, steady but precise. Jed sat across the room on the edge of the bed, watching the flames more than her. But his thoughts kept circling. She had chosen to speak a piece of truth, had trusted him with it. That meant something. He didn't need the rest, not yet. He figured if she wanted him to know, she'd say it when she was ready. Until then, he could live with silence. Silence was something he understood. Hours passed, the cabin breathing slow around them. And then her voice came again, softer this time, almost like she was talking to herself. His name was Wesley. Jed lifted his eyes. Calla's hands didn't stop working the needle, but her jaw tightened. Knew him since I was 16. Thought I'd marry him. Thought I had life figured. The cloth shifted. Her fingers trembled once before steadying again. Then it changed. He changed. Took things from me. Things I didn't agree to give. Jed didn't move, didn't speak. He sat still as stone, letting her words hang in the air, giving them space. Inside, though, his gut coiled with quiet rage. He had fought in war, had killed men for less than what Wesley had done to her. But he also knew that this moment wasn't about him. It was about her finding the strength to name what had been taken. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes searching, he only said steady and low, "You don't owe me the rest." Her shoulders sagged like something heavy had slipped loose. And for the first time since she arrived, Jed saw her look not just tired, but relieved. She nodded once, her eyes dropping back to the dress in her lap. The fire snapped, sending a shadow across her face. And Jed thought then how strange it was that his cabin, once so hollow with loss, now carried another's grief within it. Yet somehow, instead of deepening his sorrow, it lightened it, because sharing pain, even in silence, meant the weight wasn't carried alone. Later that night, when the fire had burned down to embers, Calla didn't move toward the cot. She stood near the bed instead, her shadow long across the wall. Her eyes weren't shy, not exactly. They were weary, worn, but steady. "I'm not asking," she said quietly. "Just don't make me feel small." Jed's chest tightened at the words, and for a moment he felt Sarah's ghost stir in the room, not in jealousy, but in reminder. He didn't move toward Calla. He didn't reach for her. He only nodded once, stepped aside. She untied her boots, set them by the hearth, and lay down on the bed with her back to him, still clothed. Jed sat by the fire a while longer, watching the glow fade, then finally lay down beside her. He didn't touch her. Didn't need to. Her breathing, steady against the silence, was enough. By morning, something in the air between them had shifted. Calla moved with more weight, more presence, as though she'd stopped bracing for him to push her away. She tried her hand at the stove, fumbling with the iron plates, and when Jed showed her how to work the draft, she caught on quick. She even smiled faintly when the flame held, not wide but real. Jed watched her shoulders, less hunched than before, and thought to himself that maybe she'd begun to understand she wasn't alone anymore. That day, she stayed close to the fire, mending not just her own dress, but one of his old shirts. When Jed asked if she could patch the sleeve, she nodded. "I'll try." Her fingers moved careful, slow but sure. He found himself watching the stitch, the way it drew fabric together, stronger than before, and inside, he wondered if that wasn't what she was doing for herself too. Pulling pieces back together, slow, careful, but steady. When the sun set that evening, and she handed him a plate of cornbread without asking if he wanted it, her leg brushed his again under the table. She didn't move it, neither did he. And in that quiet touch, Jed felt something rise in his chest that hadn't been there in years. A feeling not of loss, but of beginning. Or the days that followed slipped into a rhythm neither of them spoke about, but both leaned into like water, finding the grooves of stone. Calla rose early now, no longer waiting for Jed's boots to scuff the floorboards first. She took the kettle from the stove, poured water into the basin, scrubbed her hands and face until her breath came sharp against the chill. Her body still carried the stiffness of old bruises, but the tremble in her fingers had left her. Her movements were precise now, careful in a way that spoke of habit, not fear. Jed noticed. He always noticed. He never said it aloud, but there was something steady in the way she set tin plates on the table or folded blankets square without being asked. Like each small act was her way of telling him she intended to belong if he let her. Jed spent his mornings in the barn, feeding horses, checking hooves, tossing hay. The sound of his pitchfork echoed against the beams, the animals shifting with soft snorts. When he returned to the cabin, he'd find Calla near the stove, sleeves damp from washing up, hair pulled back with a strip of cloth. But once he stepped inside to see her folding one of his shirts. Worn thin at the elbows, her needlework neat and firm along the tear. She looked up, caught him watching, and for the first time she didn't shrink or apologize. She only held the shirt out to him and said, "You'll get a few more winters out of it now." Jed took it, nodded once, and something unspoken passed between them, gratitude that didn't need words. At night, the fire burned low, and they sat across from each other at the table. She would serve cornbread, beans, or salt pork, portioned evenly. No hunger in her eyes anymore, only focus. Sometimes, when the fire cracked sharp or the wind pressed hard at the shutters, her gaze wandered to the door, a flicker of the old habit. But it always came back to him steady, as if reminding herself she was still here, still safe. Jed kept his words few, but inside, he carried the weight of her presence like a warmth he hadn't known in 5 years. The cabin no longer felt hollow. It was filling with the rhythm of two people breathing under the same roof. One evening, after a supper that lingered longer than most, Calla brushed crumbs from the table and set the tin plate aside. Jed leaned back, firelight dancing across the lines of his face, and caught her watching him. Not fearful, not guarded, just watching. She didn't look away when their eyes met. Instead, she set her hands flat on the table, fingers splayed as though bracing herself, and said, "I can't keep running." Her voice was quiet, but firm. Jed studied her a long moment, then nodded. "Then don't." She let out a breath, one hand lifting to tuck hair behind her ear. And for the first time, Jed saw not just weariness, but resolve. The next morning, she boiled water without waiting for him, humming faintly under her breath, a sound so soft he almost thought he imagined it. He leaned in the doorway, arms folded, listening. He didn't recognize the tune, but the sound of it settled into him like balm. She caught him watching and froze, almost embarrassed, but he shook his head gently. "Don't stop." Her eyes softened then, and she went back to her work, her voice trailing through the cabin like something delicate that had been missing too long. Work became lighter with 2 sets of hands. Calla swept the floors, mended not just clothes, but the fraying rug near the stove, even boiled soap from lye and scraps of fat, the sharp scent clinging to the air. Jed found himself stepping slower through his tasks, listening for her footsteps, the scrape of a chair, the soft rustle of fabric as she bent over a seam. It surprised him, the way these small sounds replaced the hollow echo that used to haunt him. They weren't loud, they weren't demanding, but they were steady, filling the spaces grief had left empty. One afternoon, as Jed chopped wood by the stump near the barn, he noticed Calla standing on the porch, arms crossed against her chest, watching. The wind tugged at her hair, pulled her dress against her frame. And for a moment he thought how strange it felt to be seen, not as a widower bent under loss, but as a man still standing, still working, still living. She held his gaze when he looked up, and though she said nothing, her eyes spoke clear. "I see you." Jed's hands tightened on the axe handle, his chest heavier, but not with sorrow. With something else, something new. That evening she handed him a plate of food and sat across from him, their legs brushing beneath the table. Neither moved away. The touch was small, almost nothing. But to Jed, it felt larger than any words she might have given. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was choice, quiet and sure. He didn't call attention to it. He just let it be, breathing in the weight of her nearness. By the 5th day, the cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It carried the rhythm of work, the smell of cooking, the warmth of another voice. Jed realized, in the way a man does when he looks up from his own labor, that life had crept back into the walls. Sarah's ghost still lingered, yes. Loss never truly left. But Calla's presence had changed the air, shifted the silence. And Jed felt, for the first time in years, that he wasn't moving through the world half dead. He was beginning to live again, steady, quiet, without needing to name it. Nights grew longer, though the snow had begun to ease. The cabin settled into a rhythm of its own, a heartbeat that pulsed with 2 instead of 1. Jed would finish his supper, lean back in his chair, and watch the fire burn low, while Calla mended by lamplight. Her hands moved slow but steady, stitching cloth, folding shirts, setting them neat on the table. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It carried weight, a kind of fullness that didn't ask for filling. Jed had grown used to the sound of her breath across the room, the creak of the cot when she turned in her sleep, the scrape of her chair at the table. Small things, ordinary things. But they anchored him in ways he hadn't thought possible since Sarah's passing. And though he never said it aloud, he knew those sounds were what kept the ghosts at bay. On the 6th night, the air inside shifted. Calla sat by the fire, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Though the stove gave enough heat, she looked tired, the kind of tired that went deeper than bone. Jed studied her from his chair, his plate empty, his boots drying by the hearth. He wondered what memories pressed on her, what shadows crawled into her chest when the world went still. Her eyes lifted then, caught his, and for a moment the air thickened. He expected her to glance away as she often did, but she didn't. She held his gaze, steady, unflinching. Her lips parted slightly, as the words pressed against them, but what came out instead was silence, followed by the faintest tilt of her head, like a decision had been made. When Jed rose to add wood to the stove, she stood too. Their movements mirrored each other, crossing paths by the fire. Her hand brushed his as she reached for a log, not by accident. She didn't pull away. Jed froze the rough grain of bark under his palm, the warmth of her skin lingering like a brand. His eyes flicked to hers. She was watching him, her jaw tight. Her eyes not frightened but tired, tired of flinching, tired of waiting for permission to breathe. "I'm not asking," she said softly, her voice low but sure. "Just don't make me feel small." Jed's chest tightened. He didn't move closer, didn't crowd her. He only set the log gently into the stove and nodded once. "All right." Calla let out a breath she'd been holding, then stepped toward the bed. She untied her boots slowly, set them by the hearth, and lay down still in her dress, her back to him. Jed watched. The fire's glow painting her silhouette against the wall. He stayed by the fire a while longer, staring into the flames until they blurred, then finally lay beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't reach, but when her hand brushed his in the dark, she didn't pull it away. Jed's heart beat heavy in his chest, but steady. He lay awake for a long while, listening to the rhythm of her breath, knowing that something between them had changed. By morning, she was still there, curled against him. And when her eyes opened, she didn't look away. She moved about the cabin with a quiet certainty, heating coffee, folding the blanket, her steps measured, no longer tentative. Jed felt the shift in her shoulders, the way she carried herself straighter, no longer half curled against the memory of harm. When she spoke, her voice was even. "You're not what I expected." Jed looked up from where he was pulling on his boots. "You either." They left it at that, but the truth hung between them, a bond stitched tighter than silence. That evening, as the snow tapped lightly at the window, she washed at the basin, her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled high. Jed sat across the room, cleaning his rifle, his hands moving, slow. When she finished, she stood a moment in the glow of the lamp, her eyes on him. Then, with a deliberate calm, she walked to the bed, unpinned her dress behind the curtain. He caught only her silhouette, the fabric sliding from her shoulders, scars pale against skin, bruises fading but not gone. She slipped into her shift, plain and clean, then stepped toward him. "You don't have to hold your breath around me," she said quietly. Jed realized then that he was holding it, chest tight, with a fear he hadn't named. Fear not of her, but of letting someone this close again. He exhaled slow, set the rifle aside, and stood. She reached for him, fingers brushing the edge of his shirt, then his face. He lifted a hand, touched her cheek, her hair slow and steady as if she might vanish. She didn't. She leaned into it. Their lips met, not hurried, not desperate, but steady, the kind of kiss that settled rather than sparked. Her grip on his shirt was tight, like she didn't quite believe it was real, but she didn't pull away. Jed rested his forehead against hers. "You sure?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, her breath warm against his skin. "I am." What followed was slow, stripped of urgency. She eased him back onto the bed, her hands tracing the scars on his shoulders, her breath soft against his collarbone. He touched her as if she were glass, his hands firm but careful, sliding over the curve of her waist, the line of her hips. And when she lowered herself against him, there was no resistance, no fear, only choice. Their movements were measured, silent except for breath, the quilt shifting beneath them, the fire casting long shadows across the cabin walls. When it was over, she lay against his chest, her hand spread over his ribs, as though testing the shape of him. Jed didn't think of Sarah. He didn't think of loss. He thought only of how Calla had stopped flinching when he touched her, how her breathing slowed into sleep beside him. For the first time in 5 winters, the bed didn't feel haunted. It felt alive, and Jed, lying there in the dark, knew something he hadn't dared believe. The silence of his cabin was no longer a curse. It was a beginning. Morning light crept soft through the cabin's window, not sharp the way it had in the heart of winter, but muted, touched with the faint promise of spring. Jed stirred awake with Calla still resting against him, her hair loose across his chest, her hand draped over his ribs. For a long while he lay still, listening to her breathing, steady and even. The kind of breathing that spoke of rest, not fear. The bed that had once felt like a grave now held warmth, a body beside his by choice. And Jed let himself feel it, not as a dream, not as something borrowed, but as truth. When she finally lifted her head and looked at him, there was no shame in her eyes, only weariness edged with peace. She rose, tied her hair back, and busied herself at the stove, humming again, low and faint, as though the sound was relearning itself. Jed watched her, boots still by the hearth, and thought that for the first time in years, the morning didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something worth rising into. The days that followed carried that same thread. Snow still clung stubborn to the earth, but its hold weakened each afternoon when the sun pressed down. The land had begun to breathe again, and so had the cabin. Calla no longer kept her eyes fixed on the door each evening. She walked the yard now, Jed's old coat slung over her shoulders, boots crunching on the thawing ground. He would watch her from the barn sometimes, hammering down a loose plank, his eyes drawn to the way she moved. Not hurried, not watchful, but steady, as though she had finally let herself belong to the ground she walked on. One morning, she came in from the pump with a pail of water, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her hair tangled against her face. Jed looked at her, saw how her dress sagged loose where it had been mended one too many times, and something in him stirred. That afternoon, while she swept the cabin floor, he walked out to the shed, rummaged through a trunk he hadn't touched in years, and carried back a bundle. He laid it on the table without a word. Calla straightened, her brow furrowed, and pulled back the cloth. A dress, not new, but clean, warm, whole. Long sleeves, solid stitching, the kind of garment a woman could wear without apology. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it, her fingers brushing the fabric as though it might vanish. She looked up at him, searching. Jed shifted his weight, his ears coloring beneath the brim of his hat. "If it's all right," he said gruffly. Her lips curved faintly, the closest thing to a smile he had seen yet. "You measured with your eyes?" Jed looked away, scratching at the rough edge of his beard. "Had to guess." She stepped into the back corner, slipped the dress on, and when she returned, Jed turned and caught his breath. It fit her hips, hugged her waist, covered her shoulders. And for the first time since he'd found her, she didn't look like a woman, worn thin by survival. She looked whole. She looked herself. He set his hammer down slowly, his chest heavy in a way that wasn't sorrow this time, but something nearer to awe. Calla smoothed the skirt with her hands, her eyes shy but steady. "Better than I've had in months," she said. Jed nodded, his voice low. "Then it'll do." From that day forward, the small changes deepened. Calla walked taller in that dress, her shoulders straight, her hair brushed smooth and tied back with care. She moved through the cabin with purpose, no longer just filling space but shaping it. Jed felt it too. Each evening, when she sat beside him on the bench by the stove, their shoulders touching, he no longer felt the cabin as a shell of what had been lost. He felt it as a home being built again, piece by quiet, piece. One night, as snow fell soft against the windows, Calla leaned into him, her head resting just briefly against his shoulder. Jed didn't move. He let the weight of her trust settle deep into his ribs, and in that stillness he realized she had stopped surviving. She was beginning to live. They spoke more now, though never with excess. Her voice filled the spaces between chores, short sentences, plain truths. She told him once of a ranch near Clifton she had seen as a child, the smell of smoke and animals lingering in her memory. He told her he had no use for towns anymore. Too much noise, too many eyes. She nodded, and the way she did it told him she understood more than words could carry. They had both had their share of noise. Quiet was the language they preferred now. One evening, as the firelight painted the cabin walls in amber, she reached across the table, touched the back of his hand. Jed stopped cleaning his rifle, lifted his eyes to hers. She leaned forward, kissed him slow, deliberate, her lips warm against his. When she pulled back, her hand trailed down his arm, steady. He stood, followed her to the bed without a word. They undressed without haste, her body revealed with the calm of someone no longer afraid of being seen. And when he touched her, slow, reverent, she didn't flinch. She leaned into him, kissed him deeper, pressed herself fully against him, as though reclaiming her body with each breath. Jed moved with her, steady, grounded, letting her lead, letting her claim what was hers to give. Afterward, she lay curled against his chest, her hand tracing the scar on his shoulder. "I think I could stay," she whispered. Jed kissed the top of her head, his voice low, certain. "Then stay." She closed her eyes, her breath easing into sleep, and Jed lay awake, staring at the rafters. For the first time in 5 winters, he wasn't counting the days. He wasn't enduring. He was building forward. And with Calla beside him, he felt a truth he hadn't dared before. There was still life worth claiming, still ground worth standing on, still a future not bound by grief, but by choice. The thaw had begun to show itself in the land, a slow loosening of winter's hold. Patches of earth broke through along the fence line, dark and damp, the promise of green pressing just beneath. Jed spent his afternoons repairing rails, hammer steady, breath rising in short clouds. Calla walked the yard with sleeves rolled, her hair brushed smooth, her dress clinging to her hips in the soft wind. She moved like a woman, no longer measuring each step, no longer waiting for the ground to shift beneath her. Jed watched her sometimes, not openly, but with the quiet recognition of a man who had lived long enough to know when something broken was finding its shape again. He felt it in his chest. She was settling, not as a guest, but as someone meant to be here. It was on such an afternoon, the sun dipping low and shadows stretching long from the high-up pines, that Calla stilled in the yard. Jed was hauling water from the creek, his shoulders straining. When he saw her straighten, her hands frozen on the weeds she'd been pulling from the stones, her eyes locked on the tree line beyond the pasture. Jed followed her gaze, and then he saw it. A figure at the edge of the woods, dark coat, hat pulled low, posture leaning just enough to be recognized. Wesley. Jed set the bucket down slow, his jaw tightening. The man didn't move forward, didn't speak. He just stood there, 30 yards off, watching like a hawk circling prey, waiting to see if it would break. Jed stepped up beside Calla, his presence solid at her shoulder. "That him." His voice was low, steady. Calla nodded once, her lips pressed tight. "That's him." Wesley's smirk bent across his face, the kind that spoke of ownership, not affection. His voice carried across the yard, sharp under its calm. "So this is where you ended up." Jed didn't answer. He didn't need to. His body spoke well enough, loose but planted, ready as stone. Wesley's eyes cut to Calla. "You hiding behind him now?" Jed's voice came even, firm. "She's not hiding. She's living. You show up again, you won't be." Wesley tilted his head, smirk thinning. "You threatening me?" "No," Jed said, his tone flat as the earth. "I'm telling you." Calla stepped forward then, her shoulders squared, her voice ringing clear across the cold air. "I'm not property, Wesley. You had your chance. You ruined it. You don't get to follow me like I owe you something." Her words hung hard and sure, stronger than any he had heard from her yet. Jed felt the weight of them settle deep, her choice, her voice, not borrowed from his protection, but born from her own will. Wesley's smirk faltered, just a flicker, but enough to show the crack. His eyes darted between the two of them, Jed steady as a wall, Calla unflinching. Whatever power he thought he carried had no footing here. He spat into the dirt, his boots shifting once. You always were a mouthy thing when you thought someone was looking out for you. Jed didn't flinch. Calla didn't drop her gaze. And after a long silence, Wesley turned. His coat swung as he walked back into the woods, his figure swallowed by shadow. The yard went still. The only sound was the faint creak of branches in the wind. Jed waited until the last trace of him was gone, then turned to Calla. You all right? She nodded, but her body was stiff, her breath shallow. Jed touched her arm, gentle, steady. Come on. They sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the ridge, silence between them thicker than usual. Calla stared off toward the trees, her jaw firm. After a long moment, she spoke. I thought I'd feel scared. Her voice wavered only slightly. But I didn't. Jed studied her, the fire of her defiance still burning in her eyes. You look strong. Her breath caught, and then she said it, the truth raw as open earth. I didn't run. For the first time since I was 16, I didn't run. Jed nodded slow. Because you didn't have to. She leaned into him then, her body softening against his shoulder, her eyes still on the tree line. I didn't believe this could happen, she whispered. Any of it, that someone would help me without asking something back, that I could rest and still be wanted. Jed put his arm around her, his voice low. You're not resting now. You're building. Her eyes lifted to his, searching, full of the weight of years she'd carried alone. So what now? Jed didn't answer with words. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small silver ring, smooth, plain, nothing more than a circle of promise. He held it in his palm. I figured if you're staying, we should make it clear. Calla's breath caught, her eyes shining in the fading light. She looked at the ring, then at him, her lips curving into the first real smile he had seen on her face. Slow, wide, and certain. You asking me? I am. She took the ring, slipped it onto her finger. It fit snug, like it had always belonged there. Yes, Jed, she said, her voice steady. Yes. The fire inside the cabin burned low that night, but it was enough. No preacher, no paper, no crowd. Just two people, hands clasped. Vows spoken in the silence of a room that had been hollow for too long. And when Calla lay beside him, the ring catching faint light from the embers, Jed felt the weight of grief lift, not erased, but eased. Sarah's memory remained, yes, but it no longer haunted. It simply stood aside, leaving room for something new. By the time the moon rode high over the ridge, Jed knew with certainty what he had felt building for weeks. The cabin was no longer half lived in, it was alive. And the woman who had once curled half frozen in his barn now lay steady in his bed, not as a shadow passing through, but as his choice and as her own. The night after Wesley disappeared into the trees carried a stillness different from any Jed had known. Not the heavy silence of grief, not the brittle quiet of suspicion, but something steadier, like the land itself had taken a long breath and let it go. Calla sat beside him at the fire, her shoulders no longer wound tight, her body leaning slightly into his. The silver ring he'd pressed into her hand glinted faint in the glow of the flames, a circle of promise simple as the life they were building. She turned it once with her thumb, her face, lit soft by lamplight, and when she looked at him, there was no question in her eyes, only certainty. Jed reached across the space between them, took her hand, rough fingers closing around hers. "We'll mark it tonight," he said quietly. "No preacher, no paper, just us." Calla's lips parted, a small breath leaving her chest. "That's enough," she whispered. And it was. The vows came without flourish. Jed cleared a place on the table, set aside his tools and the remnants of supper. Calla folded the blanket neat at the foot of the bed, as though tidying the space for something holy. Then they stood facing each other, the firelight painting long shadows against the log walls. Jed held her hand, felt the bones beneath her skin, the life still pulsing there, and spoke in the steady tone he had once used to give orders in war. "I'll keep you safe here, Calla. I'll keep you fed, and I'll never let anyone make you small again." His jaw tightened. "Not while I'm breathing." Her eyes glistened, but her voice was firm when she answered, "I'll stand with you, Jed. Not because I have to, but because I choose it. I won't run anymore. This is where I stop." No more words were needed. He slipped the ring onto her finger. She squeezed his hand, and the silence of the cabin filled with something larger than sound. Two souls, scarred and weathered, standing together in firelight, making a vow that belonged to them alone. That night when they lay down, Jed pulled her close without hesitation. The weight of her head on his chest, the warmth of her body pressed against his side, carried more power than any preacher's blessing. He felt her hand rest over his heart, her breath slow as sleep came. For the first time in 5 winters, he didn't dread the morning. He looked forward to it. The days that followed bore the proof of their vow. Calla moved through the cabin not as a guest, but as a wife, though the word was never spoken aloud. She swept the hearth, kneaded dough, hung wash on the line behind the cabin. She laughed once, a low, surprising sound, when one of Jed's old shirts ripped in a place too frayed to patch. Jed froze at the sound, his hammer still in his hand, and thought how strange it was to hear laughter in these rooms again. Strange and right. Jed worked the land with renewed purpose. He broke ground for a garden along the south side of the cabin, his spade cutting deep into soil that hadn't been turned in years. Calla stood beside him, sleeves rolled, dress hem dusted with mud, her hands blistering from the work but steady all the same. "You don't have to," he told her once, his voice gruff. She straightened, pushed a stray hair from her face. "I want to." The words hung, plain and honest, and Jed knew she meant more than the soil beneath their feet. Nights grew softer. They ate by lamplight, sitting close, sharing salt pork, beans, or stew Calla coaxed from what little they had. Sometimes she reached across the table, brushed his hand without a word, and each time Jed felt the old hardness in his chest ease a little more. When they moved to the bed, there was no hesitation now, no flinch in her body. She undressed steady, deliberate, her eyes on his as though reclaiming each piece of herself with every button loosed. Jed touched her reverently, his hands tracing the scars, bruises now faded to memory. And when he entered her, their movements were not hurried but weighted, the kind of joining that carried the weight of a vow. She held him after, her fingers tracing the scar across his shoulder, her breath warm against his chest. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. Jed kissed her hair, his voice low. Then where were meant to be. Spring pressed its first green shoots through the thawing earth, and with them came signs of a future neither of them had dared to picture. Jed built fence posts sturdier than before, hammered nails with the thought of children running alongside them. one day. Calla stitched curtains for the window, plain but strong, letting light fall across the cabin in ways it never had. One evening, she pulled a loaf of bread from the oven, placed it on the table, and looked at him with a faint smile. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Jed nodded, chewing slow. "Feels alive. But more than the chores, more than the changes in the land. It was the way she carried herself that told the truth. Her shoulders no longer hunched. Her steps carried weight. She met his eyes when she spoke, and when she smiled, it no longer carried the shadow of apology. Jed saw it and felt something in himself heal alongside her. Sometimes when the fire burned low, Calla would rest her head on his shoulder and speak in a whisper of her mother, of her sister lost to fever, of years spent shrinking under Wesley's shadow. Jed listened, not pressing, not asking, just letting her voice pour out like water, long dammed. And when she quieted, he would squeeze her hand and say, "You're here now. That's what matters." She would nod, eyes glistening, and settle closer against him. By the time spring rains softened the earth and the garden sprouted its first green, the cabin no longer looked like a place abandoned by life. It was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of two people who had chosen each other in silence, in firelight, in the steadiness of work. Jed stood on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching Calla hang laundry on the line. The sun caught her hair, and when she turned to catch him staring, she grinned faintly. "Stop staring." He smiled back. "Can't." And in that simple exchange, Jed understood. Grief hadn't left him, but it no longer ruled him. The ghosts still lingered, but they no longer filled the bed or haunted the walls. Because now, beside him, was a woman who had stopped running. A woman who had chosen to stay, and he in turn had chosen her. Together, they had turned silence into vow, and vow into life. By summer, the land had shaken off its long frost. The creek behind the barn ran steady again, fat with snowmelt, its song carrying through the grass that grew thick along the banks. The garden, once only tilled soil beneath Jed's spade, now bloomed with life. Rows of beans climbing their stakes, squash heavy on the vines, carrots pressing orange against the dirt. Jed worked with his sleeves rolled, sweat beading along his neck, the sun pulling color into his skin. When he straightened from the soil and wiped his brow, his eyes always drifted to the porch where Calla stood, one hand shading her face, the other resting at her middle. He had noticed first, weeks earlier, the way she slowed when she rose from the bed, the way her cheeks filled, softening her face with a glow no winter had left behind. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching dusk settle, she had taken his hand in the silence and pressed it to her belly. He felt the curve, the smallest rounding beneath the fabric of her dress. She didn't say anything, only looked at him, her eyes steady, waiting. Jed held his palm there, rough skin against the soft swell of new life, and smiled faintly. "You staying now?" he asked, his voice low, teasing but tender. Her lips curved, and she whispered, "I think I always was." From that night, something in Jed shifted. Work no longer felt like the duty of a man scratching out survival. It became preparation for a life to come. He repaired the roof, tightened each rail along the fences, built a small pen near the barn with an eye toward goats. His hammer rang steady across the valley, each strike not only for himself, but for the woman who had chosen to stand beside him, and for the child who would soon know no world but this cabin and its fields. Calla moved slower now. Though she never stopped working, she rose early, bare feet whispering across the floor as she set water to boil. She hummed often, sometimes songs Jed didn't recognize, sometimes just notes rising and falling like the rhythm of her steps. He would lean in the doorway, coffee in hand, and listen. There were mornings he thought of Sarah, the wife he had buried 5 winters back. But it wasn't with the old ache anymore. Her memory had softened into something quieter, no longer a wound, but a shadow that nodded in approval at what had come after. Calla wasn't replacing her. She was writing something new beside him. The neighbors from town spoke little of Jed Nolan these days. He had long been known as the man who kept to himself, his cabin half lived in, his face worn from solitude. But should any wander past now, they would see laundry strung on the line, a garden heavy with growth, smoke curling from the chimney at dusk. They would see a woman in a simple dress, her belly rounding beneath the fabric, her face alight with strength, hanging clothes with steady hands. They would see Jed step out onto the porch with his hammer still in his fist, but his gaze softer, his eyes no longer turned inward to loss, but outward to life. Evenings became their sanctuary, supper by lamplight, her hand brushing his across the table, the murmur of shared sentences. Sometimes they spoke of the past, Calla telling stories of her mother's herb garden, her sister's laughter before fever took her. Sometimes Jed shared fragments of his years in war, the weight of friends lost, the silence that had followed him home. But more often, they didn't speak at all. They sat close, shoulders touching, letting the fire fill the spaces words couldn't reach. And when the lamp was turned low and they lay down together, her body curled into his, the ring still snug on her finger. The cabin no longer felt haunted. It breathed with them. One night, as rain tapped the roof and the garden drank deep, Calla turned in the dark, her voice soft but sure. I want this child to know what it means to stay. To grow up without fear, without running. Jed tightened his arm around her, his lips brushing her hair. Then that's what we'll give him. His words were simple, but his heart beat heavy with the vow they carried. He had lost once before, had buried hope beneath the weight of grief. But now, with Calla's warmth against him and life stirring beneath her ribs, he felt something he hadn't dared in years, faith that tomorrow would come and it would be theirs. As July burned hot across the valley, wildflowers sprang bright along the fence posts, and Calla's laughter, rare but true, spilled from the porch as she watched Jed chase down a stubborn goat that had slipped its pen. He grumbled under his breath, but when he returned, sweat-soaked and cursing soft, she grinned wide, her eyes shining. You look alive, she told him. Jed shook his head, a rare smile breaking across his face. I am. The cabin that once echoed with emptiness now held more than sound. It held memory, promise, and breath that belonged not to ghosts, but to the living. Jed no longer counted winters. He counted the rows of beans stretching green along the garden, the weight of Calla's hand in his each night, the steady thrum of new life growing in her belly. And as the sun sank golden across the ridge, painting the sky in colors fierce and tender, he knew the truth. It didn't matter how it had begun. Her in a torn dress, half frozen in his barn, him hollowed by loss and silence. What mattered was what they had built. Not loud, not fast, but steady. A home, a family, a life worth carrying forward. And for Jed Nolan, that was enough.